Floyd, and obviously this has ramped up the community conversation around this issue. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations at rallies with people in communities that haven't been disproportionately impacted by this, and I'm talking mainly in Connecticut, suburbs, rural areas, that they see protests strictly about police and the interactions between people of color, particularly Black people, and the police. As we know, who have been doing this work in the criminal justice arena, and certainly as people in those communities know, that this is much more than that. And so we thought it would be a good idea to be able to have a conversation about the broader issue of the justice system and the role that it plays now relative to the early days of the U.S. and slavery. So Brian Stevenson, who heads the Equal Justice Initiative, put together this short clip. It's a short clip, but it's really poignant. And we've worked with him over the past year. Brought him, and he actually got the Yukon Dodd Prize. You may have seen his film Just Mercy. And he's a seminal voice in these conversations these days. So we're very pleased to be able to present this, and very happy at the panelists who are joining us today. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the conversation.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of Black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the Black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free Black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end. It simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us, folks. I'm Stan Simpson, the moderator for this panel. We've got a great group of folks here to discuss this very short but very profound video. I mean, I would argue it's very concise and very precise, and that should be almost a must-see in a lot of these schools. A lot of folks don't understand the history and the vestiges of slavery. So let's be joined here by our panel. I want to also tell the audience out there that as we have the conversation, feel free to use the chat room to ask any questions. I will see your questions, and we want you to be very much a part of the conversation. So we are joined today by Anthony Hatch. He is Professor Anthony Hatch of Wesleyan, an expert in healthcare, science, social inequities, among other sectors. We have attorney Preston Tisdale. He's with Koskoff Koskoff Bieder. He's also a member of the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparity in the Criminal Justice System. We're hoped to be joined later by Professor Dan Broyld from CCSU, a historian, and I think Josh should let me know when he's here. We'll start with Mr. Hatch. Disparities. You see disparities a lot in healthcare, and in your world, you see it in medicine and science. America has never really truly come to grips with slavery and sort of the vestiges of slavery. Why is that?
It's a good question, and let me just say that it's a pleasure to join all of you. Some of you I know, some of you who I don't yet know. But racial inequality is built into what America is. America requires that racial disparity. It requires that racial gap. It requires that racial hierarchy that is referenced in the film. First starting of course in terms of legal rights and unequal representation under law, then transformed into an economic relationship under slavery, where Black people literally didn't own their own bodies and were in fact owned by others. And then of course transformed in all sorts of ways since. So we've seen just this evolution of a racial order that requires the subordination of Black people, the devaluation of Black people, their killing and maiming, as was referenced, their kind of a system of brutality, and that is again just is very much part of what America has been from the very beginning. So you know, the film references that 1 in 3 Black men can expect to spend time in prison. I just saw, of course, in the wake of the most recent uprising, you know, an astounding figure that 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to be shot by the police. You know, 1 in 1,000. It's just a remarkable testimony to where we are. And of course, we could have conversations around health inequality and in many other areas, education, housing, and the rest, all of which are connected to, I think, the protest for this moment.
Mr. Tisdale, Attorney Tisdale, let's talk about sort of the vestiges. We see these vestiges of slavery. We see it in the prison system. We had a forum last week in Connecticut. 75% of the prison population, 75, is African American and Latino. In the state itself, about 28% are African American and Latinos. You have a major disparity in the population and what's in the prisons. You see it in the redlining with insurance. You see it with the police situation. You see it with banks. You see it with insurance. You see it with education. You even saw it with the COVID funds where they were giving out money to small businesses, and most of the minority businesses didn't get their money. So what do we do from a legal standpoint? Because it starts there. It doesn't appear to be the political will yet to put these things on the books. Why is that, Attorney Tisdale?
Well, the political will is moving in the right direction. But the first thing that has to be understood is we have never come to grips with slavery in this country. So racism is indelibly interwoven into the fabric of this American society, and it's there. And the problem you have is that it originated in slavery. It was not an accident. Did not come out of thin air. It did not become because people didn't like the way somebody looked or they didn't have enough time to spend time with people. It was a specific construct designed to justify the bestiality, savagery, and viciousness which we were confronted. So that's the first thing. We have to understand it because it radiates out of that in all of our vestiges of functioning here. And the thing is, like I say frequently, we humans, we have short conscious memories, but we have long subconscious memories. And the principles of slavery have been driven home hard into the brains of the American public. So it radiates into every aspect, and people don't even realize it. So it goes into the fact that right now it's very appropriate because when we talk about the Black male, we were considered inherently dangerous during slavery. And that continued during Jim Crow. In each situation, not only did the police were involved with enforcing slavery, they're involved with enforcing the status quo. So I'll just point this out just in my prefatory remarks to just say, when you look at it very carefully, there's a documentary by Katrina Brown, Slavery by, the documentary is called Traces of the Trade. And her family were the most esteemed, highly regarded family in Rhode Island, Bristol, Rhode Island. Well, she later learned they were the biggest slave traders. That's where their wealth and prominence all came from. Rhode Island was the slave trading capital of America. People forget these things. So we don't know where it came from. And so she said, you know, the interesting thing, it hid in plain sight. And she said, they knew what they were doing. They knew it was wrong, and they did it anyway. But nobody thinks about that. You know, nobody thinks about where these thoughts came from. We have to begin to explore because it radiates and infects every aspect of our criminal justice system. Just one other little thing. If you look at Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, and in the South, you see, one of the things these sorts of ideas morph into conventional wisdom. And when he wrote his book, he's a white Mississippian. And he was the Atlanta bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. And when he did his book, he found out that the criminal justice system was used to re-subjugate African Americans after slavery ended. So what they did was we weren't slaves under the 13th Amendment, but they used the criminal justice system to arrest, detain, and use as enforced workers. And I point this out because it radiates, as I said, throughout the entire system. People don't even realize where their thoughts come from, but they're there. And the racism's there. When that woman, that Central Park dog walker, she knew she could press that button and say an African-American male had attacked her. You see how it's all pervasive? So we have to begin to attack racism at its roots. We have to understand we've never come to grips with slavery here at all in this country. It's been overlooked. There's another interesting book by Susan Neiman, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And she said the interesting thing, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the war of the narrative. So that all those stereotypes of blacks being slow, lazy, they're dangerous, they're violent, they're vicious, it all came from slavery. And it never ended. It's part of our culture. You know, Hollywood pumped out hundreds of movies which are sympathetic to the Confederate narrative. And it's in our books, it's in our social being. So we have to attack it at its roots in order to begin to make progress at the extension of those roots.
In South Africa, they had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yes.
Post-Mandela, right, you had a bloodless revolution where Mandela been in prison for 27 years fighting against the government, came out, was elected, an extraordinary story, no blood was spilled. He's a very peaceful man, at least, he was peaceful, but he'll tell you in his younger days, he wasn't so peaceful. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was done to say, listen, let's get everything on the table, warts and all, and not just from the white oppressors. People don't realize that. It also said the truth from the folks who were the revolutionaries. They wanted their truth because they had done some things that were sort of foul too. And with the understanding that, okay, we put all our dirty laundry on the table and own it, then we can begin to move forward. Why have we not been able to have any kind of truth and reconciliation here in America, even with the black president?
Yeah, America, because they...
Let me do Mr. Tisdale, let me get Mr. Hatchett, and then you follow up on him, okay? Sure.
No, I imagine we might, say something very similar in this regard. Part of the refusal of America, and by America, we're talking about white America, right? Where white American culture, this cultural system that Mr. Tisdale is referring to, right? This powerful system of white supremacy, right? Cannot look at the violence it carried out to achieve its position, right? And still be supreme, right? It can't look at that violence, look at the genocide of our indigenous brothers and sisters, look at the colonization of Africa, right? And of course, enslavement and everything that's followed since in the current system. It cannot face it. And be...
Is it guilt? Are we saying it's guilt why America can't have the conversation?
I think that, I wouldn't want to psychologize it, because the other point I want to make is in terms of how we face America's history of slavery, face racism, and it has to do with the money. It has to do with the loot. I mean, the principal economic outcome of slavery was that America was able to amass enormous wealth with free labor. So, and then, of course, every other single cheat that's been designed since then. So, how are we having this conversation and not having a conversation around reparations, around massive social investment? I mean, that's what defunding the police is fundamentally about. It's like, all you're giving us is the police.
But you can't have reparations until you have an acknowledgement of the pain that was suffered, right?
This is the other point I was going to make. So I'm a sociologist by training, and we've known for 100 years plus exactly what happened has happened, right? In history, in sociology, in anthropology, and all the different social science disciplines, there's been 100 years of debate about the problem of race. And how we understand the position of the so-called Negro, how we explain America's racial problem. And, from our side of the street, we know pretty well, what those harms have been. We know what what thievery has taken place. And we know, and we can chronicle down to the molecular level, the ways in which the racial order impacts Black people and people of color. So, I don't think this is a question necessarily of having the right information or the right knowledge, because I think right now there's a broader crisis around what people believe to be true, right? There's very complicated systems of propaganda, I think, in this moment, so that are hard to get past.
Mr. Tisdale, you're up there, so let me be very specific. Look at our schools now. There's a big push in public schools to include embed Black history as part of the regular curriculum, not just during Black History Month. And so, one problem that no one's talking about is that if teachers don't understand Black history, and I think we're losing Mr. Hatch. I see, looks like we're maybe having some problems there, but Mr. Tisdale, I hope you're still there. If teachers in our public systems don't understand the history you're all talking about, what are we doing? Because you can embed Black history all you want, but if teachers don't understand some of the knowledge you guys have dropped the last few minutes here, what's going to happen? How does that work?
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you spoke of acknowledgement and truth and reconciliation. America has never acknowledged its wrong to the extent. It's always glossed over it. So that book that I mentioned by Susan Neiman, what she talks about is how in countries like Germany, they had to come to grips with what they did during World War II. And she said it wasn't easy. She said, folks did not want to kind of own up to what they did, but eventually with a concerted movement, they did. And once it became part of the public discourse, now in understanding, you can move forward. In America, it's always been a denial factor. It's all upon us. And so just when you heard Professor Hatch talk about the incredible wealth that was created, the wealth was so incredible. That's what enabled America to move forward. And that's not acknowledged. And that wealth which was created enabled all the European immigrants who came over here and worked in all the industries that were created by enslaved labor. So, for instance, you take the cotton mills that were built in Lawrence, Mass., Lowell, Mass., all that cotton came from enslaved labor. So all those Europeans who came in and worked in there, they wouldn't have had any jobs but for those enslaved Africans. And so when the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission is absolutely a must. That's first and foremost, because it has been continually swept under the table. But what we're saying, it's a cancer. And as I said earlier, it's indelibly interwoven into the fabric of our society. Well, now it's eating at that fabric. And if we don't deal with it appropriately, it will destroy the society.
Now, so it's after you had the moral authority of Nelson Mandela. And it seems what's lacking right now in America, there's no one who can galvanize the respect of Black, white, Latino. Nelson Mandela was a person highly regarded for his past, his conviction. He had the moral authority to say, let's do this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and have the transparency to say, even he, as a revolutionary, did some things that he was not very proud of. Are we missing that right now? The person with the moral authority to have that conversation.
The other thing was what it took.
Let me do this. I'm going to go back to Mr. Hatch. In fact, I understand that Professor Dan Broyld from CCSU is here. He's a historian, African history. So once you have to hold your comment, Dr. Broyld,
sure.
Are you here? And then Mr. Tisdale, Mr. Hatch, you can follow after he comments. But let me get Mr. Broyld here. Are you here, sir?
Yes, I am, sir.
Yeah, we're having an interesting conversation here on race and racism, and we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and how Nelson Mandela had the moral authority to kind of get this thing convened and get the truth out about the atrocities of apartheid. And that once the truth was out, then healing could begin. The conversation was that we haven't had that conversation here in America on slavery, the atrocities of slavery, and the vestiges of slavery today in policing, banks, et cetera, So the question is, when do we have at any point the moral authority? Is anyone out there who has an ability to bring everyone together to have an honest conversation about race, racism, slavery, et cetera?
So, I mean, I think that's an important question. I think that the question doesn't lie within one individual. I mean, even Dr. King, warned about having a black messiah, because once the black messiah is killed, right, whoever that person is, you need other leaders to kind of take over. So I like the fact that this kind of current movement has a lot of different people. And two, he even talked about the localization of leadership and stuff like that. You're right. It would be nice if somebody could embody all of those things, but I think it's nice that we have, women, people of different genders. We have a conglomerate of people that are kind of making the call and the pitch to the powers that be that, that change is needed. And so I kind of like that approach than kind of the singular or, the kind of singular figure, if you will, at the top. Mm-hmm. And I think it speaks to, a more kind of democratic way of doing things in a more kind of localized situation as well. But I mean, we talk about the moral authority. I mean, Black people, they lead a lot of movements, and the moral authority. I think that they've always kind of had a good disposition for that, because of the things that they've endured and the way that they've reacted to the things. I think it's been humane amongst Black people, the situations that they come from, and that they're not more more violent or more outspoken about these things. I think that they have been very moral in their approach to change and to getting change, and kind of playing by some of the parameters of the kind of political system to advocate change.
Mr. Hatcher, Tisdale, thoughts on that? Again, he's arguing that you don't need that one titular leader, that it has to be organic, and that's a better approach. But at the end of the day, there has to be laws changed, and there has to get things. Would you agree or disagree that you have to have somebody or some people who are around the charge? Because at the end of the day, laws have to be changed and things have to be done, and it takes leadership to get these things done.
I think that you have to, and Dr. King stressed this in some of his writings, that this movement to transform American society has to be a mass movement. And you have to have people in the streets, even in a time of a global pandemic. The people are risking their lives, in order to make a demand that the system change. I think that your question presupposes a certain kind of model of power and resistance that isn't quite clear to me what kind of people's power is going to be required, and through what mechanisms to achieve the kind of transformations that are necessary, right? Setting aside the Truth and Reconciliation Commission idea, of course, we can put together a commission to study X, Y, and Z, and our government can do that fairly well. But when you're talking about going up against that deep American capital, right, built in slave wealth, the university system of which I'm a part, for example, was built on slavery. A wonderful book called Ebony and Ivy chronicles this, and this across American society. So I think that what Black Lives Matter and what this global movement, it's global, in all 50 states, right? We've never seen a movement like this.
And 13 countries.
Yeah, an international movement is really raising questions about how the people are going to seek remedy from the government that claims to represent them. And if that government cannot provide that remedy, then the people have a demand for that government to change. And so it's not just, of course, and I'm sure Mr. Tisdale, I hope to hear forward what he has to say on this point, but it's not just a government institution that needs transformation, laws and such. It's an economic system that state is designed to protect. So you have those two systems working closely in tandem with, of course, the cultural system, right, circulating that makes it very confusing for the citizens to know what's best. So that makes it very difficult for people to know why they suffer. So that's why they're out in the street, because they know they're in pain. They know that the pandemic has sharpened that pain, And so, the people don't know what laws need to be passed, but they know that the situation that they're in is not working.
Here's a question from the chat room. And again, I encourage all the folks who are tuned in to put your questions into the chat room. I am seeing them. If you can keep them concise, that will help out because my eyes are going out. I'm getting older, so keep them concise. But this question, I'm going to paraphrase it. Basically, it speaks to that America has a problem with the truth, not just with the race, but with Vietnam and the what he or she's calling the genocidal policies in Vietnam, the U.S. support for apartheid in South Africa, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. This person is arguing that it's not just race America can't come to terms with, but all the atrocities it has sort of been engaged with. I'll throw it out to all you guys. Let's see, Mr. Tisdale, I haven't heard from you. What's up, Mr. Professor Broyld? Since you joined in late, let's get you back into the conversation. Professor Broyld, what about that? That America is not just race. America's got a problem telling the truth in anything that it's involved with atrocities.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a major part of the problem with America is coming to terms with the truth, and that truth, like Douglas said, power concedes nothing without demand. That truth isn't going to come forward without the demand that we're seeing. And you think about it, everything that has happened in American history, and what has been said about blacks is a lie. I mean, you think about even enslaved people, they called enslaved people lazy. I mean, really? I mean, what an oxymoron, right? They said that black men wanted to rape white women. Well, that's what white men were doing to black women, right? And so everything that they called us, right, we're ignorant, right? And so who instituted the first public schools in the American South? It was blacks during Reconstruction because they wanted to be educated that benefited, Southern whites as well. And so everything they've said about us, I mean, in a sense, they are themselves, right? You know what I mean? And so it's like this weird, that's why they call it a peculiar institution, because it's peculiar because they're lying about what blacks are, because really that reflects perhaps what they are, right? Like, you know what I mean? And so that is the kind of truth in the situation until we come to really reckon with that. Whites have to really reckon with that. I mean, that's their responsibility to, moving this nation forward, is to reckoning with their past. I mean, we have to reckon with ours all the time, right? I mean, we deal with our present, in the past, if you will, and how these things merge, and hopefully that won't be our future, right? And so, I mean, it's a responsibility of us all to kind of, wrestle with that truth, but a lot of that, is kind of placed on whites to really reckon with that past.
Let me ask you guys a question, too. It's a great answer. I want to talk about the evolution of thought, right? In recent days, the evolution of thinking. We're seeing now where NASCAR is saying they're not going to have Confederate flags flying at their tracks anymore, right? You saw Drew Brees, who, frankly, in his previous years had donated millions of dollars to communities of colors, but still recently said that he equated the Kaepernick knee to anti-America, to anti-patriotic stances, then had an evolution of thought when the black players talked to him and said, okay, I kind of get it now. It's not tied to that. Roger Goodell, the NFL, saying, we support Black Lives Matter. I mean, you're seeing interesting evolutions of thought. So my question to you all is it superficial, or is it time to seize the moment when those sort of faces and voices are saying, you know what, I think we had this wrong?
Yeah,
Do you believe them?
It's time to seize the moment, because...
Do you believe them? Do you believe those folks, Drew Brees and NASCAR and Goodell? Do you find it sincere?
Well, to a degree, but we have to recognize the depth of the hardwiring of racism that was put in place during slavery. My firm, for instance, we represent Tamara Lanier. You may know her. She was former chief probation officer in New London, and we're suing Harvard University. And in the course of that suit, we have understood that Louis Agassiz, who was this revered scientist, he was the one that really promoted a pseudo-scientific doctrine of the inferiority of blacks. And that doctrine, his work, has remained alive and well in America during slavery, and he did it in 1850 while the Fugitive Slave Act was being fought. And it remained, as I said in Susan Neiman's book, afterwards. And it's remained in effect until now. That's why we have to get to the underpinnings of the slavery and the beginnings of racism. And then to Professor Hatch's point in terms of talking about the finances, that's a really critical issue. Because, of course, we received no compensation during slavery and built this incredible wealth. After slavery, there were not even instances, massively, where we began to receive payment and began to accumulate wealth, serious wealth, in terms of, and to the point that, once again, those ideas of racism, which were so thoroughly ingrained, could not be accepted by segments of the American population. And conspiracy was put together in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 48 city blocks of burnt down of the Black Wall Street, because blacks live better than whites. They massacred hundreds of blacks. And the same scenario took place in Wilmington, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, just keep on going. But the problem is our intergenerational wealth was destroyed. And in those cases, unfortunately, going back to nowadays, the police were part of the group that went against us. Now, police in the statutes are known as peacekeepers. But this whole idea of law enforcement, the militarization of police, unfortunately, in our community, that's been the norm. And they were involved with the mob. It was not disorganized who destroyed it. My point is, so therefore, we lost intergenerational wealth. And then when the GI, when Social Security came along, they made sure that agrarian workers and domestic workers were exempt. That was us again. And so as the GI Bill came out, we could not get money once again because of redlining, and half the time when we did, it had to be in redline areas. So my point being is, yes, people are truly questioning those ideas, but they don't understand. They think racism just comes out of thin air, or, because I'm not being nice. No, it was a specifically designed system to dehumanize, denigrate, and debase the people who were being subjugated.
So how do you seize an opportunity? The question is, how do you seize when there's evolution of thought among prominent entities, organizations, people? NFL saying Black Lives do matter. NASCAR saying we're not going to do the flag, the Confederate flag. We understand it's hurtful. When a guy, Drew Brees, says, you know what, I was wrong. I should have connected the kneeling to the flag. How do you seize on that? What kind of action can be taken? And Professor Hatch and Professor Broyld, I want you to chime in on this, please.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm skeptical of these corporations and these white media figures and sports figures all of a sudden realizing that it's probably in their financial interest and in their public image interest to not appear racist. They seem to have no trouble with that in the past, the very recent past. They're asking us to forget the things that they just done and said, their actual hiring policies and firing policies and how they promote within their own organizations. So I would encourage people not to be distracted by these kinds of gestures, because what's really necessary is fundamental change in the key institutions that reach out and govern people's lives. We want to be governed differently. And honestly, what the NFL does doesn't necessarily relate to how I'm governed as a citizen of the United States.
Dr. Hatch, Professor Hatch, you had a really good point, because the NFL, if you follow their history, has always been about the money. And the rhetoric, when they were against the kneeling, it matched the rhetoric of the sponsors and the folks who were uncomfortable. Therefore, they're against it. Now they're seeing that it's sort of cool that Black Lives Matter, and now they're for it. So the NFL will always be about where the money will flow for them. That's a very good point you're raising. Professor Broyld, same question. Do you believe the sincerity of these folks who have evolved in thought, or what is your feelings on seizing the moment?
I think it's great what the last panelist just said. I mean, it's about how people want to be governed, and how Black people in the United States, frankly, we can be better governed. I mean, when you look at all of the kind of major issues in the United States, whether it's healthcare or gun control or education, I mean, Canada and, Europe has already fixed those things. Nobody's having a conversation in Europe like, hey, what about our, should we give people health care? Should we control guns? I mean, these are non-conversations in other countries. And I think that we have to demand those same, conversations and get legislation behind it. We need to change as a nation. And that change, what's good for Black people is good for the nation. What's good for poor people is good for the nation, right? We talk about, a nation should be judged by how it treats the least of these, right? I mean, and so I do think it's a question of governance, and, should education at a state institution be free? I mean, these are real questions that need to be addressed, and I think our students and I think, future generations and generations now are going to ask these questions and demand better government.
Here's a good question from our chat room. And I, again, encourage you all. We have about 15 minutes left. We have some good questions here. I want to go this one here. Do the panelists think a national boycott would be effective as part of the peaceful protest? For example, shopping at certain stores, playing college sports, mainly football and basketball. I'm not sure the point is there, but there's been a movement there's been sort of a renewed buy Black movement, shop Black movement as part of the protest, and not as an anti-white stance, but simply to reaffirm Black entities, Black businesses. Your thoughts on, as part of this protest and movement, Black folks patroning Black businesses as part of the reaffirming or protest of what's going on now? All you can weigh in on that.
Well, the Black purchasing power has been well documented. During the Civil Rights Movement, we called it selective buying. And going back to one of your earlier questions in terms of a leader, it takes all of the above to move the needle. It takes the legislative initiative. It takes the grassroots movement on the ground, such as Black Lives Matter. It takes the legal community to take up the cases. None of it happens in a vacuum or by itself, insularly. And I would mention, in terms of when we look at the civil rights movement, you had Martin Luther King, but then you had Thurgood Marshall. And my late senior partner, Mike Koskoff, wrote that script for that fabulous movie, Marshall, and showed how he risked his personal life to move forward. So it takes all of that. And it takes all of that to build to a point to move. So I would say, yes, selective buying is a strategy, is a tactic. By itself, it won't achieve the full goal, but it takes the full panoply of actions.
I mean, I'll just say one comment about this and offer kind of I know we're almost at time, and offer a closing thought from my end. And this ties back to one of the questions from the chat room from earlier about America's dalliances abroad as connected to how they treat Black people here. The United States is a settler state. It's a colonial state. It was the 13 colonies, but it in and of itself became a colonizing entity. And that colonial relationship extended to the political realm, the economic realm, and the social realm. And if there's one thing we know about the colonizer, they're never willing to give up anything. They're not just going to give it up. And so, to boycott white businesses, yet leave capitalism intact, doesn't seem to me to be, a recipe for long-term transformation. We need the economic system of racial capitalism to end.
Yeah, and I'm not sure they're saying boycott white businesses, but patronize Black businesses. Maybe saying the same thing, but they're taking the boycott aspect out. There's not an anti-white stance but reaffirming Black businesses, keeping the dollars circulating in Black communities?
Yeah, I'm not gonna, hate on Black businesses in this space, but my point is a critical one, and that is to say that, it's the system of racial capitalism that has to be interrogated and dismantled. You cannot have racial equality in the United States or globally until you confront that economic system. That is the system that gave us slavery. That is the system that gave us Jim Crow. That is the system that gives us mass incarceration today and all of its effects. So the policing function that we're criticizing in the streets right now has emerged to keep those resources hoarded, right? To ensure that those resources do not get redistributed in a way that is fair and just. So it's the fundamental economic systems of our society that need to be rethought, and that is where we have to be focused.
Professor Broyld, I want you to weigh in quickly, but I want to go to the chat room because we have a little bit of time, but I wanted you a chance to give some equity on this question. Protest, buying Black, and as part of the movement to patronize Black-owned businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I would just piggyback on the last comment. It is a structural, problem of capitalism that is kind of the overarching issue. I don't think in the meantime, though, and I think the last Speaker Josh was just alluding to that. I don't think in the meantime, it's a good thing to patronize, Black businesses. They're underserved, they're underfunded, they're underpatronized. I myself went to Howard University, and so it's something like sometimes the mainstream culture, they think like when we're supporting Black business or we say that we're going to support Black businesses, we're segregationalists, which is fundamentally wrong. Segregation is a white institution. Like Black people are just we're responding to it. Even now, if you look at it now, it's a problem when Black people go to white schools. It's not necessarily a problem when white people go to Black schools. Like nobody really cares. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so it's always been a problem when we enter their spaces, right? And so, and two, some of the greatest integrationalists went to Black schools, Oprah Winfrey, right? Dr. King, I mean, they went to Black schools and still fought for integration. We're not segregationalists, that's a white institute. White people did that. Like Black people don't necessarily have problems with white people being in their spaces. I went to Howard University. White people went to Howard. No, nobody ever, nobody was brutalized. No white person was brutalized on Howard's campus because they went there, right? It's a problem when Black people go to white schools. They get called the N-word, and they, you know what I mean? And so it's very interesting how we try to kind of turn that switch and trying to say, like, that Black people are doing something wrong when they're advocating for Black businesses. But it is a big structural problem. I don't think in the meantime, patronizing Black businesses. I
want to piggyback on your comments, going to the chat line. Good question here. You guys are getting some good questions. Thank you for being engaged. Again, we have a few minutes left, so I'm trying to get all the questions in. This one says, in many conversations about race, we typically only see Black and brown people leading the conversation. How do we hold white people accountable to be active participants in these conversations as well? Or you can weigh in. Professor Hatch, you can go ahead and lead us off. You're batting first.
Well, I'll just say very briefly that I don't think that one. It was the great Derek Bell, right? Who demonstrated in his work Silent Covenants, a brilliant book I commend to everybody in this space. That nothing was ever really nothing was ever achieved on behalf of the rights and bodies of Black people in this country without also benefiting whites. White people are going to have to get involved if we're going to achieve a transformation of any kind. In this country, it's got to be. Do
Black folks have to invite them, or should they be stepping up and getting involved?
I mean, I think that we haven't really talked about this in this space, but there are complex cleavages of social class and race and geography that matter in this space. We need a multiracial, multi-class movement to upend this order, to make it more fair. And if we get stuck in conversations around voice and who can speak, who can't speak, we're leaving people who are holding all the cheddar to just keep holding the cheddar while we're over here talking, right? So I think we need to move past some of the conversations and worry less about who has voice and who doesn't have voice, and talk about the material relationships and the material deprivations and thievery that has led to this United States.
Mr. Tisdale, your thoughts on the role of white people being more front and center in this battle against racism?
It'll take all to move the needle. And one of the things that the encouraging factors that we've seen in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, we've seen thousands upon thousands of whites step forward. Whites who are not particularly, a lot of them may not be really advanced in understanding racial dynamics, but they saw something that was fundamentally wrong. It was totally opposed to the propaganda that has been put out. And I would like to point out, when he was murdered, these murders have been taking place for years, but one of the differences now is they're recorded. And for all these years, one vestige of slavery was, oh, you can't believe what the enslaved Africans say. So in these cases, when they were brought to court and you sued, witnesses were not believed because we were black. Once again, that's one of those threads and that hard wiring that's in our system. So people are seeing it, and what we're seeing is there are a lot of people of goodwill. And now it's the time for people to really understand the full dynamics of racism, which emanated from slavery, and realize that it's all hands on deck. And if people step forward, we have to accept the fact that they're stepping forward with goodwill, tap their talents, their expertise, and their energy to make this a much better place.
All right. Real quick, I want to have our director, Andrew Clark, close us out. We have about 2 minutes left. Just final thoughts. The role of white people in being front and center in this movement.
Yeah, I think it's important that, and I've heard this a lot, people just talk about, the kind of human race. I mean, I think that's an important, standpoint. I mean, blacks have been kind of categorized as super or subhuman. I mean, all we want is just to be recognized as a part that we're human. And I think you've seen that articulated with Floyd. I mean, if you put your knee on anybody's neck for 8 minutes, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're, black, white, or polka dot. I mean, you're going to die, and it's going to be a painful death. And so, I think that what people are seeing is that, a recognition of that, of not recognizing that man's humanity. And so I think that it's important to kind of have these conversations of, kind of how race has been constructed, but also that, people, we want to move the human race ahead. And the way to do that is to recognize everybody's humanity. And particularly blacks have been looked at as super and sub, and we just want to be recognized as human, as everybody else.
And I want to close I think we have 2 questions pending about getting more young folks involved and about multiracial sort of consolidation of the labor force, a labor strike, multiracial. I do want to close on time at 4 o'clock, so I apologize on getting thoughts on that, but I do want to go to our director, Andrew Clark, and to close things out. And thank you to the panelists, Professor Broyld, Professor Hatch, Attorney Tisdale. You all were phenomenal. Thank you for your thoughts and insight.
My pleasure.
Andrew? Sure.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Thank you so much, Stan. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody. It was a tremendous conversation, very enlightening, and we are hoping that this will be shared in many spaces. And one of the reasons why we designed it in this current state was just to give voice, to be able to allow for this conversation to be had. And I want to say with regard to Dr. Broyld, we've been at the Institute, and I don't believe we've met, and I look forward to engaging with you more at CCSU, but we've been administering the Alvin Penn Act for a number of years now, and that's racial disparities in traffic stops. And for me, it's always been so fascinatingly frustrating to have a conversation about just getting up to equality and people in terms of who's being stopped and for what reasons, and that just no one's asking from Black and brown communities to subjugate through traffic violations and the use of police in the same way that they have been. It's just been asking for equality and not even being able to hold that as a goal and rather be distracted from that in terms of how the analyses are being done and all this other stuff has been so frustrating. So your point is very well taken there. And I'll say, I grew up in a white suburban community, but I moved into Hartford in about 25 years ago. And I'll also agree with what your statement there. I was never welcomed, but anything with other than open arms. The folks, my neighbors, have always been supportive of me and thankful of me being here, and I can definitely attest to the fact that that is not the case in suburban communities. And the frustrating thing, too, I think, what I find is the vestiges that, all the professors have talked about that now have resulted in our current reality make people in the suburbs think that they're somehow better than. And I think that's a narrative that has to be addressed and for people to come to a full reckoning. I don't want to have the last word, though, Stan, and I do think we have a few more minutes. I would like to put to a question because we haven't specifically talked about Connecticut. And I'll just say in terms of power in the legislature, one of the things that I saw was that we have yet to have, to my knowledge, a Black governor. We've yet to have a Black Speaker of the House. We've yet to have a Black President pro tem. Those have always been glass ceilings, have never been reached. A lot of the reason is because of the representation in our state and where the power lies. And there's simply not enough representation in Black and brown communities to be able to hold sway over those votes. So it's going to take people in the suburbs and white communities to allow that power secession to occur. And so I'd like to hear from panelists in terms of what do they think we should be doing directly in Connecticut to address this issue.
I mean, I'll just say, I'm probably, I'm not sure about the other panelists, but I'm relatively new to the state. I'm living here in 2015 from the state of Georgia, where I had been born and had been raised at least and spent a lot of my adult years. And so the conversation here is different than the one in Georgia, I'll say, on many levels. But I think that the politicians need to get behind the people in this case, right? I live in West Hartford. We had a Black Lives Matter protest in West Hartford, and and it was just an amazing thing to see. 1,000 people out in the streets calling for the humanization of Black people and calling to protect their lives. Marching around. So from Governor Lamont on down, these they can nickel and dime this problem all they want, but the big investments are necessary, and all the things that the police and the carceral state have been designed and funded to do, they're not doing particularly well. So we need to reorganize how we do that, how we organize this sector of our government to meet the people's needs. And so radical proposals are welcome.
Chris, I'm curious, what is the conversation in Georgia? You mentioned that there's a disparity in Georgia, Connecticut. What are they talking about in Georgia?
Well, I mean, I was just saying, in Georgia, Georgia is historically is a very conservative stronghold, both in terms of its local politics all around the state. I'm from the Atlanta area, where Atlanta is a predominantly Black city, and it's had some fairly progressive leadership, particularly right now with Mayor Bottoms holding it down there. But the subordination of Black people is part of what it means to be a Georgian, right? I'm from the city of Stone Mountain, where we have a massive Confederate memorial emblazoned on the side of the 6 piece of exposed granite. People go there to hoot and holler and celebrate every evening in the summer. So, the conversation around racial uplift and coming up with Black people is very different down there than it is up here, if they even notice Black people here in Connecticut.
All right. What I'm going to do is this. Since we're a little bit over time, I want to remind you all, again, thank you all for tuning in. Remind you, at the very near future, we're going to have an encore presentation of a documentary called Camden's Turns. The 28 minutes, it talked about the dismantling of the Camden Police Department and the reimagining and what they did and how violent crime dropped 60% and how the police went from a mentality of being warriors, quote unquote, to a mentality of being guardians and being public servants. It's a phenomenal video. I didn't learn about Camden really until this Friday film forum we have here with IMRP, but it's a phenomenal story. It started getting some traction. So we'll keep you all posted when people say, well, gee, how do you reimagine police? How do you go about doing that? It's been done, and we're going to hit that again in coming weeks. But I want to thank you all again for your getting involved, phenomenal perspective and insight, and thank our audience out there, and wish you all a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, everybody.